Hello. Welcome to tonight's bedtime story by Lucid Tales. I hope your day has been warm and full of love. But whether it has been gentle breezes or howling winds for you, it's time to relax now. Find somewhere comfortable, maybe your bed or a favorite armchair, and make sure you're ready for sleep. Take your shoes off if you can, and feel the freedom in your toes, the little loosening that means it's time for bed. Tonight's story is The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. Our story begins with a wicked wizard, the most mischievous creature that ever existed, who loved all that was twisted and nothing that was good, who laughed at the pain of others and plotted to cause all manner of strife and misfortune. This wizard one day, after many moons of cunning and cruel work, succeeded in crafting a mirror that made everything beautiful appear twisted, poor and mean, while that which was good for nothing and ugly was shown magnified and increased in ugliness. In this mirror the most beautiful landscapes looked like boiled spinach, and the kindest faces were turned into frights, their faces so distorted they could not be recognized. And if anyone had a little sneer or a sad frown, you might be sure that it would be magnified and turned into the cruelest of expressions. When people looked into the mirror, they would lose hope and heart, and say to themselves, "How stupid I've been. It's all wasted. Everything is terrible, and it's not worth trying to be good or kind." But one day the mirror was broken, dashed and smashed into 100 million and more pieces. And now it worked much more evil than before, for some of these pieces were hardly so large as a grain of sand, and they flew about in the wide world, and when they got into people's eyes, there they stayed. And then people saw everything perverted, or only had an eye for that which was evil. This happened because even the very smallest bit had the same power which the whole mirror had possessed. Some people even caught a splinter in their heart, and their hearts became like a lump of ice. Some of the broken pieces were so large that they were used for window panes, through which one could not see one's friends. Other pieces were put in spectacles or other seeing glasses, and worse still was the sight that those poor folks beheld. The finest splinters still flew about in the air, and sometimes one or other might catch a new person unawares. Now, in a town where there were so many houses and so much to do that there were almost no gardens at all, there lived a boy called Kay and a girl called Gerda, in houses opposite one another. Each floor of the houses was wider than the one below, so that far above the road the little rooms of the boy and the girl up at the top of the houses almost met in the middle. There they had window boxes on their little balconies, and grew all manner of fruits and roses, and there they played together all through the hot summers. But when the winter came, and the windows frosted with ice feathers, and the snow howled, they could not play, and had to run all the way down the stairs to meet in the street or in one another's houses. There they watched the snowflakes swirling outside like a swarm of white bees. "Do the white bees choose a queen, like the honeybee?" asked Kay. Kay's grandmother smiled. "Yes," she said. "She flies where the swarm hangs in the thickest clusters. She is the largest snowflake of all, and when she comes by, the windows freeze and frost until they look like flowers." In the evening, when little Kay was at home, he climbed up on the chair by the window and peeped out of the little hole he breathed on the frosted glass. A few snowflakes were falling, and one, the largest of all, landed on the edge of a flower pot. The snowflake seemed to grow larger, and at last it was like a young lady, dressed in the finest white gauze, made of a million little flakes like stars. She was so beautiful and delicate, looking made of dazzling, sparkling ice. Yet she lived. Her eyes gazed fixedly like two stars, but there was no calm in them. She nodded toward the window and beckoned with her hand. The little boy was frightened and jumped down from the chair. It seemed to him as if in the same moment a large bird flew past the window. The next day it was a sharp frost, and then the spring came. The sun shone, the green leaves appeared, the swallows built their nests, the windows were opened, and the little children again sat in their pretty garden, high up on the leads at the top of the house. That summer the roses flowered in unwonted beauty. Gerda and Kay sat among the beautiful flowers and played in their window boxes. But after only a little while, Kay cried out, "Oh, I feel such a sharp pain in my heart, and now something's gotten into my eye." Gerda put her arms about him, and he winked and blinked with tears in his eyes. "I think it is out now," he said, but it was not. It was one of the pieces of glass from the magic mirror that had got into his eye, and another piece had got right in his heart, where it was already turning to ice. It did not hurt any longer, but there it was. "What are you crying for?" he demanded, shaking Gerda off. "You look so ugly. There's nothing the matter with me." And then he looked around and wrinkled his nose in a sneer. "Ugh," he said. "That rose has a canker in it. And that one's all crooked. They're not such pretty things after all." And he snatched at them and tore them up by the roots as Gerda cried out against it. Afterward, if his grandmother told them stories, he always interrupted her, or he would get behind her, put on her spectacles and imitate her. He copied all her ways, and everybody laughed at him. He was soon able to imitate the gait and manner of everyone in the street. Everything that was peculiar and displeasing Kay knew how to imitate. And everyone said, "The boy is certainly very clever." But they did not like him for it. It was the glass he had got in his eye, the glass that was sticking in his heart, which made him tease them all, even little Gerda, whose whole soul was devoted to him. One day the next winter, he gathered snow in his coat and made Gerda look at it through a glass with him to see how perfect the flakes were when everything else was so flawed. Then he rudely left her to go and play in the square with the other boys. He sat on his toy sled in the dirty snow and waited for one of the carts to come by to tie it to and ride along behind for a while. But all of a sudden, in a spray of snow, a great magnificent sleigh churned into the market like an icy wind, painted all in pristine white, and with a rider in a white fur mantle and white fur hat. In a flash, Kay tied his sled to the great sleigh and took off behind it, faster and faster, until before he knew it he was outside of the city, and out he knew not where, with the snow falling thickly around him. As the sleigh flew over the fields, Kay became frightened, and cried out to be let go, for he could not untie his sled with his frozen fingers. At last the sleigh stopped, and the white figure driving it stood up. It was the Snow Queen, dressed in a cloak of white fur. "We have travelled fast," said she, "but it is freezingly cold. Come under my bearskin." And she put him in the sleigh beside her, wrapped the fur around him, and he felt as though he was sinking in a snowdrift. "Are you still cold?" asked she, and then she kissed his forehead. Oh, it was colder than ice. It penetrated to his very heart, which was already almost a frozen lump. It seemed to him as if he were about to die. But a moment more, and it suddenly felt quite warm to him, and he did not feel the cold that was around him. But what became of little Gerda when Kay did not return? Where could he be? Nobody knew. Nobody could give any hint. All the boys knew was that they had seen him tie his sledge to another large and splendid one, which drove down the street and out of the town. Nobody knew where he was. Many sad tears were shed, and little Gerda wept long and bitterly. At last his mother said he must be dead, that he had been drowned in the river which flowed close to the town. Oh, those were very long and dismal winter evenings. At last spring came, with its warm sunshine. But Gerda could not believe that Kay was dead. And when she spoke to the sunshine and the sparrows, they could not believe it either. And so she put on her little red shoes, the most precious things she possessed, and went down to the river outside of the city and said, "If you have taken Kay, I will give you my red shoes if you will give him back." And she threw her red shoes into the water. But the river would not take them and brought them back to the bank for her, for it did not have little Kay. And so Gerda got into a little boat, thinking she had not thrown them far enough, and leaned over the edge and threw them in again. But the boat became loose and began to drift down the river with the current, so that Gerda had no way to shore. The banks on both sides were beautiful. Lovely flowers, venerable trees, and slopes with sheep and cows, but not a human being was to be seen. "Perhaps the river will carry me to Kay," said she, and then she grew less sad. Presently she sailed by a great cherry orchard, where there was a little cottage with curious red and blue windows. It was thatched, and before it 2 wooden soldiers stood sentry and presented arms when anyone went past. Gerda called to them, for she thought they were alive, but they of course did not answer. She came close to them, for the stream drifted the boat quite near the land. Gerda called still louder, and an old woman then came out of the cottage, leaning upon a crooked stick. She had a large, broad-brimmed hat on, covered with beautiful flowers. "Poor little child," said the old woman. She went into the water, caught hold of the boat with her crooked stick, drew it to the bank, and lifted little Gerda out. "Come and tell me who you are, and how you came here," said the woman. And Gerda told her all. And the old woman shook her head, and when Gerda had told her everything and asked her if she had seen Kay, the woman answered that he had not passed there, but he no doubt would come soon. And she told her not to be cast down, but to taste the cherries and look at the flowers, which were finer than any in a picture book, each of which could tell a whole story. She then took Gerda by the hand, led her into the little cottage, and locked the door. The windows were very high up. The glass was red, blue, and green, and the sunlight shone through quite wondrously in all sorts of colours. On the table stood the most exquisite cherries, and Gerda ate as many as she chose. While she was eating, the old woman combed her hair with a golden comb, and her hair curled and shone around that sweet little face, which was so round and like a rose. "I have often longed for such a dear little girl," thought the old woman. "This child is a gift from the gods." And when Gerda fell asleep, the woman went out into the garden and shook her stick at every rosebush, and made them disappear back into the ground, for she feared that the sight of them would remind Gerda of Kay, and she would disappear off after him. But it was not long before Gerda, glancing idly one day, caught sight of the flowers on the woman's hat, and in her drowsy afternoon state, one of them seemed to her to be a rose. "Kay!" Gerda cried, waking up. "I have stayed so long." And she ran out into the garden, and remembering that the witch woman had spoken of flowers telling stories, asked each one if they knew where she might find Kay. But every flower stood in the sunshine, and dreamed its own fairy tale or its own story, and they all told her very many things, but not one knew anything of Kay. And so off she ran to the further end of the garden, to the gate. The gate was locked, but she shook the rusted bolt till it was loosened, and the gate opened, and little Gerda ran off barefooted into the wide world. She looked around her, but no one followed. She saw that the summer had passed. It was late in the autumn, but she had not noticed in that beautiful garden where the sun shone and flowers bloomed all year round. "Oh no, how long I have stayed," said Gerda. "Autumn is come. I must not rest any longer." Oh, how tender and wearied her little feet were. All around it looked so cold and raw. The long willow leaves were quite yellow, and the fog dripped from them like water. One leaf fell after the other. Only the sloes stood full of fruit, sharp and bitter. Oh, how dark and comfortless it was in that dreary world. Soon Gerda had to stop to rest, and opposite her a large raven came hopping over the white snow. He had long been looking at Gerda and shaking his head, and now he said, "Caw, caw! Good day, good day!" "Oh, Raven," said Gerda, and told him all of her tale, and asked him had he seen Kay anywhere on his travels. The raven nodded very gravely and said, "It may be, it may be." "Do you really think so?" cried the little girl, and she nearly squeezed the raven to death in a mighty hug. "Gently, gently," said the raven. "I think that it might be little Kay, but now he has forgotten you, for the princess." "He is with a princess?" asked Gerda. "Yes, listen," said the raven. "But it will be difficult for me to speak your language. If you understand the raven language, I can tell you better." "No, I have not learnt it," said Gerda. "But my grandmother understands it, and she can speak gibberish too. I wish I had learned it." "No matter," said the raven, and did his best to tell her what he knew. There was a princess who was very clever and had read all of the books in the castle and all the newspapers in the world, and had decided that now she was bored she should find a husband, but he must be as intelligent as herself. The princess had advertised for a husband, and legions of good-looking young men came to the palace to try their luck. But all were struck dumb by the beauty of the princess and the opulence of her palace and pearl throne, and went away empty-handed after standing like gasping fish with flapping, wordless mouths. "But Kay," said Gerda, "when did he come?" "Patience, patience. It was on the third day, when a little personage without horse or equipage came marching right boldly up to the palace. His eyes shone like yours. He had beautiful long hair, but his clothes were very shabby." "That was Kay," cried Gerda. "Oh, I found him!" And she clapped her hands for joy. "He had a little knapsack," said the raven. "His sled," said Gerda. "That may be," said the raven. "But my sweetheart at the palace said he was not the least abashed. He said to the guards, 'It must be very tiresome to stand on the stairs. For my part, I shall go in.' His boots creaked too, so loudly, but still he was not at all afraid." "That's Kay for certain," said Gerda. "I know he had on new boots. I heard them creaking in his grandmamma's room." And on he went boldly up to the princess, who was sitting on a pearl as big as a spinning wheel. All the ladies of the court with their attendants and attendants, and all the cavaliers with their gentlemen and gentlemen's gentlemen stood round. But he was bold and nicely behaved. He had not come to woo the princess, but only to hear her wisdom. She pleased him, and he pleased her. Yes, for certain that was Kay," said Gerda. "He was so clever. Oh, won't you take me to the palace?" "I will see what I can do," said the raven, and flew away. That evening the raven came back. "My sweetheart says she will let you in through a little back door," he called. "Come, Gerda, let us find your friend Kay." So Gerda hurried to the castle, where another raven was waiting, who quietly ushered her in and up the back stairs. "I think there is somebody behind us," whispered Gerda, and something rushed past. It was like shadowy figures on the wall, horses with flowing manes and thin legs, huntsmen, ladies and gentlemen on horseback. "They are only dreams," said the raven. At last Gerda reached the princess's room, and within there were 2 beds, one of lily white, in which lay the princess, and one of red. Gerda crept closer to the red bed and pulled away the scarlet cover. As she lifted the light to look at the boy's face, all of the dreams came rushing back in, and he awoke and turned his head, and it wasn't Kay. Gerda burst into tears of disappointment and grief, waking the princess too, and though she had crept into their bedchamber as a barefoot stranger in the middle of the night, they were not angry with her. They listened to her story and pitied her, and did all they could to help her. They gave her new boots, and even a golden carriage to help her on her way. And so Gerda went forth, newly shod and at greater speed. They drove through the dark wood, but the carriage shone like a torch, and it dazzled the eyes of the robbers so that they could not bear to look at it. But then, "It's gold! It's gold!" they cried, and they rushed forward and seized the horses, knocking down the coachman, and pulled little Gerda out of the carriage, and they might well have killed her at once, but for a little robber girl who bit the robber with the knife hard enough to make him cry out, and demanded that Gerda be given to her as a playmate. "Do not fear," said the robber girl. "They will not kill you unless I'm angry with you. And even then I won't let them. I'll do it instead." When they reached the robber's ruined castle, the little robber girl fed Gerda with rabbit and rat and pigeon, and showed her reindeer that she kept tethered to a pillar by her bed, and made her tell her all about Kay and her journey to find him. Eventually the girl fell fast asleep and started to snore. But Gerda, afraid and cold, could not sleep. High above her head the wood pigeons cooed from the rafters. "We have seen little Kay, riding through the sky in the Snow Queen's great sleigh." They sighed and shuffled their wings. "She would be taking him to Lapland, where the snow and ice never melt." "Yes," murmured the reindeer. "The Snow Queen has her summer palace in the far north, and near the Great Pole, on the island of Spitzbergen, is where she keeps her great home." "Oh, Kay. Poor little Kay," sighed Gerda. "Do you choose to be quiet?" said the robber maiden. "If you don't, I shall make you." In the morning Gerda told her all that the wood pigeons had said, and the little maiden looked very serious. But she nodded her head and said, "That's no matter. Do you know where Lapland lies?" she asked the reindeer. "Who should know better than I?" said the animal. "I will set you free to return to Lapland," said she, "if you will take Gerda with you to find her friend Kay." The reindeer gave a bound for joy. The robber maiden lifted up little Gerda and bound her fast on the reindeer's back. She even gave her a small cushion to sit on, and bread and ham for the journey. "Good luck," she said seriously, and slapped the reindeer's rump to startle him. And Gerda stretched out her hands toward the robber maiden and said, "Farewell." And the reindeer flew on over bush and bramble, through the great wood, over moor and heath, as fast as he could go. Night and day they flew through the forest and mountains until the reindeer said, "There are my old northern lights. Look how they gleam." And soon they came to Lapland. Suddenly they stopped before a little house. Nobody was at home, except an old Lapland woman, who was dressing fish by the light of an oil lamp. Gerda told her of her story, and of Kay, and the woman said, "You poor thing. You have far to run still. You have more than 100 miles to go before you get to Finland. There the Snow Queen has her country house, and burns blue lights every evening. I will give you a few words from me, which you will take with you to a Finnish woman I know, and she will help you." When Gerda had warmed herself and had eaten and drunk, the Lapland woman wrote a few words on a dried haberdine, and Gerda and the reindeer travelled on, until at last they came to Finland, and the Finnish woman's house. There was such a heat inside that the Finnish woman wore hardly any clothes. She immediately pulled off Gerda's gloves and boots and gave the reindeer ice to keep cool, and read what was written on the fish skin. "You are so clever, weather worker," said the reindeer. "You can twist all of the winds of the world together in a knot. Will you give Gerda a potion, that she may possess the strength of 12 men and vanquish the Snow Queen?" "The strength of 12 men," said the Finland woman. "Much good that would be. 'Tis true little Kay is at the Snow Queen's, and he thinks it the very best place in the world, because he has that splinter of glass in his eye and in his heart." Then she drew the reindeer aside. "As for Gerda, I can give her no more power than what she has already. Don't you see how great it is? Men and animals are forced to serve her. She gets through the world barefooted. She must not hear of her power from us. That power lies in her heart. If she cannot get to the Snow Queen and rid little Kay of the glass, we cannot help her. Take her to the edge of the Snow Queen's garden, where there is a bush with red berries, and then return here." And so the reindeer and Gerda were bundled out of the door again so quickly that Gerda left behind her shoes and gloves. When they reached the red berry bush, the reindeer was sorry to leave Gerda alone and barefoot in the snow. When he had disappeared back into the night, Gerda was almost at once surrounded by swirling snowflakes, seeming like fierce soldiers, but other snowflakes fell, like white angels, and led her on, keeping the soldiers at bay. The walls of the palace were of driving snow, and the windows and doors of cutting winds. Mirth never reigned there. Vast, cold, and empty were the halls of the Snow Queen. The northern lights shone with bright precision and lit everything. In the middle of the empty, endless hall of snow was a frozen lake. It was cracked in 1,000 pieces, but each piece was so like the others that it seemed the work of a cunning artificer. In the middle of this lake sat the Snow Queen when she was at home. And then she said she was sitting in the mirror of understanding. As Gerda crept through the halls of this icy palace, she heard above the howling wind and falling snow the strange sound of scraping, and followed it. There, in a great, strange chamber, was Kay. Little Kay was quite blue, yes, nearly black with cold, but he did not know it, for the Snow Queen had kissed away all feeling of cold from his body, and his heart was a lump of ice. He was pushing and dragging pointed flat pieces of ice, which he laid together in all possible ways, for he wanted to make something with them. In his eyes the figures were extraordinarily beautiful, and of the utmost importance, because the glass in his eye made him think so. "Kay!" cried Gerda, and ran forward and threw her arms around him. He was so pale and cold he almost seemed made of ice, and he did not greet her. Then Gerda, in her grief and frustration, the fears she had endured and the great trials of her journey, wept hot burning tears, and they fell onto Kay's face and chest, and they thawed out that lump of ice in his heart and warmed him again. Then Kay too wept, and cried so many tears that they quite washed out that shard of glass in his eye, and at last he recognized her. "Gerda, where have you been so long? And where have I been?" He looked around him. "How cold it is here," said he. "How empty and cold." And he held fast by Gerda, who laughed and wept for joy. They ran together away from that cold place, until they came again to the red berry bush, and found waiting there the reindeer, with the second reindeer he had brought along. They rode back to the house of the Finnish woman, where they warmed themselves, and then on to the Lapland woman's house, and at last down to the edge of the snow, where the green of spring was just beginning to peep above the ground, where they said farewell to the reindeer. And the first green buds appeared, the first little birds began to chirrup, and out of the wood came, riding on a magnificent horse, a young damsel with a bright red cap on her head, armed with pistols. It was the little robber maiden, who, tired of being at home, had decided to make a journey to the north, and afterwards in another direction, if that did not please her. She recognized Gerda immediately, and Gerda knew her too. It was a joyful meeting. "You are a fine fellow for tramping about," said she to Kay. "I should like to know if you deserve that one should run from one end of the world to the other for your sake." She rode with them for some time, before at last, promising to visit them, she sped off and away on her adventure, and there ahead, Gerda and Kay saw the beloved walls of their own city. It was as if nothing had changed. The roses grew overhead, and Kay's grandmother still sat by the window, and there in their window boxes were Gerda and Kay's accustomed seats. The flowers grew thickly and scented the air with delight, and it was almost as if the Snow Queen and the ice and the glass had been a dream. Some of those with the glass still in their eye might have said it was, or merely a fairy story. But Gerda and Kay were both older now, and wiser, and they knew better. And so do we, don't we? Good night. Sleep well, and I will see you tomorrow for another bedtime story.